Good morning to everyone. Christhel. So, Christhel Andrade Diaz, we are here to listen to your work, presenting your work about the sustainable role of agricultural residues in future bioeconomy strategies and its dependency upon carbon returns to arable soil. So you will have about 45 minutes to present your work. And before giving you the floor, I will present the different persons of the jury. So first, the two reviewers. I will start with Björka Wieke, who is a professor at the Radboud University in the Netherlands. We have in my right also Professor Jorgen Olsen at Aarhus University, Denmark. Then we have three examinators. First, we have Mrs. Sonia Kielen, that is a senior researcher at Agroscape in Switzerland. We have also Mr. Florent Levasseur, who is a researcher at the Hummer Ecosys at INRAE. We have also Jean-François Soussana, who is in video with us, who is a research director at INRAE. Then I can present the two directors. So first, Laurie Hamelin, and also in video, Mr. Ezekiel Zamora. Sorry, Laurie Hamelin is from here, of course, INRAE and TBI. And Ezekiel Zamora, who is a co-director with a PhD, and who is at the University of Manabí in Ecuador. And then I can present myself. I am professor at INSA Toulouse and a member also of TBI. Okay, so you have 45 minutes.
Good morning and welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to have you here to present my doctoral thesis entitled The Sustainable Role of Agricultural Residues in Future Bioeconomy Strategies and Its Dependency from Carbon Returns to Arable Soils. The presentation will start with a short introduction on what drives this research. Then I'll introduce the research questions and objectives. I'll present the methods and results developed within the thesis, and I'll wrap up the presentation with the overall discussion. So first, the starting point of the study are crop residues because they're abundant in dense agricultural regions and they are in high demand to supply renewable carbon for the bioeconomy. However, crop residues are a source of carbon to maintain the soil organic carbon stocks balance, and thus play a key role in the overall soil health, fertility, and productivity. Here on, I refer to soil organic carbon as SOC. Therefore, when assessing the potential of crop residues, there is the common consideration that not all the harvestable crop residues could actually be harvested, this to avoid SOC depletion. However, these recommendations and considerations do not take into account that the crop residues are going to be used to supply a bioeconomy conversion pathway where a co-product rich in recalcitrant carbon is often co-produced. This co-product could be returned to the soils as a strategy to maintain the SOC stocks. Moreover, setting universal thresholds, this considers that we need to take into account the specific pedoclimatic conditions into the SOC dynamics. So in this research, we put the question, what is the carbon neutral harvesting rate of crop residues in temperate and tropical environments when considering the return of bioeconomic co-products? Here we developed the terminology carbon neutral harvesting rate to refer to a situation where supplying crop residues to the bioeconomy does not decrease the long-term SOC stocks compared to those that we will have if the crop residues would have been left on the soil. So this question has many implications. First, that the crop residues are going to be used in a conversion pathway and that the co-product will return to the soils. Here we included 5 pathways, being pyrolysis, where we co-produce biochar, gasification, co-producing char, hydrothermal liquefaction, hydrochar, anaerobic digestate, and the second generation bioethanol fermentation, where we focus on the liquid residue called molasses. To avoid confusion on the terminology, here on we call pyrolysis biochar as pyrochar and the gasification char as gas char. As I said, SOC dynamics are acutely influenced by the specific pedoclimatic conditions of the area, and thus the question involves also a geographical scope and is especially explicit. So for the temperate environments, we represented it with the country of France, and the tropical environments were represented by Ecuador. The question involves also the temporal scope, which was said to be 20, 50, and 100 years. And more importantly, this is a relative research where we compare a bioeconomy situation versus a reference one where the crop residues are not harvested. This is called the business as usual, BAU. So to answer this main question, we developed sub-questions and objectives. First, we needed to know how to integrate the supply of crop residues to the bioeconomy and the stocks evolution. And we did so by quantifying the carbon flows and the recalcitrance of each co-product within the soil models. We wanted to know how much additional biomass could be supplied to the bioeconomy if we consider that the co-products are returned to the soils compared to the BAL threshold. We did so by adapting a soil model to include simultaneously 5 of the bioeconomy co-products, and we used the model to perform spatially explicit SOC simulations in both geographical scopes. And after we evaluated the SOC stocks and the carbon neutral harvest rate, we posed a question if there existed any trade-off between the carbon neutral harvest rate and the full environmental impacts of the supply chain. We shed light to that by performing a life cycle assessment where we consider the full use of the main product and the return to the soils of the co-product. So here we'll present the results of the first question and objectives. We answered that by performing an exhaustive literature review where we tried to understand the amount of carbon present in the crop residues that will be directed to the bioeconomy pathway and then remain in the co-products, and also how this carbon in the co-products being recalcitrant will behave when input in the soil. Briefly, we call recalcitrant to any material that is reluctant to degradation. This review yielded a database, a harmonized database containing 620 data records presenting cereals and oilseed crops, which was later expanded to include extra 110 data records representing tropical crops. So in this database, we present the fraction of carbon in the crop residues that will remain in the co-products. This was accounted based on mass balances where we follow the full pathway of carbon, and we call this the carbon conversion coefficient. We also present the fraction of recalcitrant carbon contained in the co-products, what we call the carbon recalcitrance coefficient, and we determine based on laboratory incubations, field trials, and modeling assays. Besides the fraction of carbon, the database also contains the reported mineralization rate, mean residence time, and carbon remaining after 100 years, as well as the priming effect. Briefly, the priming effect could be defined as the change in the turnover of soil organic matter induced by new treatments compared to the typical treatment of leaving the crop residues. So when the turnover is slower, this is called to be a negative priming effect, and where the turnover is faster, we call this a positive priming effect. Besides determining these parameters to characterize the co-products, we also reviewed 12 soil models well known to determine how we will include them within a soil model. However, we need to know that these coefficients are not global value for a specific co-product, but they depend on specific process conditions, feedstock, and assessment methodology, and those are characterized based on that on the database. Once we define the characteristics of the co-products and we selected a soil model, we proceeded with the modeling framework. So although each case requires their specific considerations based on the data availability and the geographical scope, we try to provide a simplified framework that could be adapted to different regions, temporal scopes, and scenarios. So the framework is based on intersecting the soil and climate maps of the areas under study to produce what is called the pedoclimatic units. The pedoclimatic units there are populated with information regarding the soil stocks, and these are crossed with the land use map of the country to determine which area will we study within this project. So in here, we selected croplands, and those all areas dedicated to livestock are considered out of the scope. In this stage, we can also set the constraints of the study as the minimum surface or the types of crops that are going to be included. And so these combinations produce the Agricultural Pedoclimatic Units, APCU. When we include farming management information to these APCUs, like for instance, crop rotations, fertilization, irrigation, etc., we produce the simulation units. The farming management information will be different to one scenario to other, depending on the data availability in the country. The simulation units will be ready now to be input to a soil model, and they will provide the location for the simulations. And thus they will need to be input with information regarding the soil characteristics and meteorological variables. The soil characteristics required by the model differ among them, but they could be, for instance, the clay content, pH, bulk density, etc. And the meteorological variables are basically the temperature, precipitation, and evapotranspiration. As this is a model in a study trying to simulate the future, we use future meteorological variables based on the RCP 4.5. Now this information could be input in the soil model, which was adapted for the bioeconomy. So first, the crop residues yield in the simulation units needs to be converted to carbon inputs. This is done using allocation equations, harvest rates, and other parameters, depending on the model. And also the most important part of the simplified framework in our study is the introduction of the co-products parameters, where we included the parameters developed in the previous section, the carbon conversion, carbon recalcitrance, and priming effect within the soil model. When all of this has been done, we can determine the soil stocks evolution. Given the big geographical area covering countries and the high spatial explicitity, the study needed to be automatized using R. However, we need to consider the different scenarios within the study and the timeframes. And moreover, we need to evaluate the sensitivity of the results to a variation in the co-products parameters, so we perform sensitivity analysis. So to summarize the case studies, for the case of France, we define a time frame of 100 years from 2020 to 2120. And for Ecuador, the time frame was from 2020 to 2040, but we set a second time frame from 2020 to 2070. We set this time frame based on the availability of long-term meteorological data in the countries, which for Ecuador existed only until 2070, but also to see any difference between the near and long-term simulations. The soil model selected for France was AMG because this is a carbon-focused soil model, which is relatively easy to manipulate and has been well validated for temperate climates, specifically for France. However, it has not been validated for tropical regions, and so we use ROTC to represent the Ecuadorian case. The adapted parameters included in the French case were those that we presented in the previous section, the carbon conversion and carbon recalcitrance, but also the carbon labile fraction, which will be the amount of carbon that will be readily mineralizable when we input it in the soil, and is represented as 1 minus the carbon recalcitrance. In ROTC, we tried to include more parameters, and so we input also the mineralization rate of the labile and recalcitrant carbon fractions and the priming effect. The baseline used for the simulations are key for the results, and for France, it already existed. It was developed within the 4 per thousand study of INRA, and it was provided by the study of Linné. But for the case of Ecuador, the cropping systems baseline did not exist, and we developed it within the study. And the simulation units produced, as I said, in France, we have well-systematized information, and so they yielded over 60,000 simulation units, while in the case of Ecuador, it was over 15,000. This caused because in Ecuador, the farming management information is not yet systematized. So we will now look at the results of the French case. First, we need to highlight that these are relative results comparing the bioeconomy scenarios versus the business as usual at the end of the simulations. As a trend, in France, 10% of the areas are already providing the crop residues to supply another service or production. So for instance, for livestock bedding. So this area is considered to not be able to supply the bioeconomy. The remaining 90% of area then is potential to supply the bioeconomy. In the case of biochar, we notice that all the simulated areas will produce a stock increase compared to the business as usual. And this increase will be in average 100%, but it could go up to 400% in some areas. So therefore, we determined that 90% of the area under study could export all the harvestable crop residues to the bioeconomy. In the case of gas char, we noticed similar results with all the areas being able to supply the bioeconomy. However, the difference with the biochar case relies on the overall stock change. That here is an average 43%, and it could go up to 172. The difference between gas char and biochar remains on the conversion pathway because gasification is a more mature technology where the carbon is converted mostly into syngas. So the amount of carbon remaining in the gas char is lower than that is input through the biochar. In the case of hydrochar, we found that 2% of the north area will lose stocks up to 1.8% if we harvest all the crop residues. But the remaining 88% of the areas could provide all the harvestable crop residues with stock expected to increase up to 4%. In this case, hydrochar is interesting because it's a thermochemical co-product that has a high recalcitrant fraction. However, the quality of this recalcitrant carbon is different than the quality of gas char and biochar. While gas char and biochar are mainly composed of aromatic compounds, the hydrochar is mainly composed of aliphatic compounds, which makes it less recalcitrant. The case of digestate is also interesting because the difference between the crop residues and the digestate lies mainly on the presence of the carbon labile fraction within the crop residues, which has been already converted to biogas in the digestion process. So the recalcitrant carbon in digestate is basically the same lignin that will have remained on the crop residues, but in a condensed form. So here we found that 50% of the area could export 100% of harvestable crop residues. However, the areas that will show a potential stock decrease will decrease up to only 3.5%. And the case of molasses presented negative results for all the simulated areas, and thus it was considered to not be of interest for the bioeconomy scenarios. After this assessment, we determined an extra potential of 71 to 225 petajoules to supply the bioeconomy in France, compared to the common recommended threshold, which is approximately 32% for France. However, we needed to test the sensitivity of the results to a variation on the parameters, and so we performed active and extra scenarios. The sensitivity was considered within this study in two ways. First, in how the combinations of the minimum, average, and maximum values for the carbon conversion and carbon recalcitrance will interact. So for instance, in the figure E, we have the average carbon conversion and carbon recalcitrance that will produce the results we just presented. But in figure F, we will conserve the average carbon conversion, but with the maximum possible carbon recalcitrance. While in figure H, we present the maximum carbon conversion with the average carbon recalcitrance. So these combinations allowed us to identify which of the parameters have a bigger impact on the overall results. And here, for the case of biochar and gas char, the biggest impact was produced by the carbon conversion coefficient. This was explained because the range of variability of carbon recalcitrance is rather small compared with the range of variability of carbon conversion. But in the case of digestate, for instance, we notice that both carbon conversion and carbon recalcitrance have an equivalent weight, and so the overall results depend on the specific combination. This means that the performance of the scenario will be heavily dependent of the efficiency of the production system. The other way on how we tested the sensitivity in this case was on how we input the co-products within the model. So in the average way, we considered that 95% of the carbon was recalcitrant in biochar. As the mean residence time of biochar is considered to be over hundreds of years, we consider that this will remain unaltered within the full time frame of the study. However, based on the review, we determined that after 100 years, only 75% of the carbon recalcitrant will remain. So we consider this in a second way to incorporate the co-product within the model. And the remaining 20% was considered to be slowly mineralized within the time frame. This consideration did not change the conclusion, as all the simulated areas continued to be able to supply the whole harvestable crop residues, and all of them showed increase on SOC stocks. However, the average SOC was changed, which was first 106% and now it's 84%. In the case of Ecuadorian croplands, we also noticed for biochar similar trends, with all simulation units presenting increase on SOC stocks and thus being able to supply completely the bioeconomy. In the case of gas char, it was similar as what we noticed in the French case. All the simulated areas could export 100% of the harvestable crop residues. However, the SOC change is slower than that observed for biochar. So while in the biochar case, the average SOC increase was of 63%, in the case of gas char, in here it was 15%. The difference is the same as we explained for the French case. However, hydrochar and digestate case presented different results than those observed for the temperate lands. Here we observed that for those scenarios, all the simulated units will deplete the SOC stocks if we harvest the whole available crop residues. This is explained by the difference on temperature and moisture, which in tropical lands is higher than in temperates. So we consider, based on this, that the potential of the hydrochar and digestate scenarios for bioeconomy in Ecuador is 0, but we will have an extra 113 petajoules if we consider the implementation of biochar and gas char scenarios. The sensitivity analysis in Ecuador, as we already somehow tried to identify the implication of the carbon conversion and carbon recalcitrance in the French case, here we focus more on the priming effect. So here we compared a situation of a biochar with no priming effect and a situation when we consider the average priming effect of biochar, which is a negative effect of 71.4%. We noticed that we still continue to be able to harvest all the crop residues. However, the net SOC change is different. While with no priming effect, 8% of the surface will increase the SOC stocks over 100%. If we consider the priming effect, this 8% becomes more than 52%, which means a twofold SOC sequestration potential when we consider the implication of the priming effect. Until now, we have had only half of the story based on stock stocks and the crop residues that we could harvest. However, now we will look at the full environmental implication with the life cycle assessment. Because maritime fuels are currently a hotspot for reducing the greenhouse gas emissions, we selected this as an application case for the main products of the conversion pathways of the study. This is a hotspot being just last April included in the European Union emission trading system. So here we take the case of sustainable maritime fuels to replace the fossil maritime fuels towards the greenhouse gas emissions reduction. The consequential LCA thus has the goal to reveal the trade-offs between the carbon neutral harvest potential and the overall environmental impacts of the food supply chain, with the goal to identify the best management option. The functional unit was set to be the management of 1 wet ton of harvestable crop residues per year. We followed a well-to-wake approach where we accounted the emissions from the acquisition of the raw materials to the use on board of the fuel. So the geographical scope of the study was set to France, and we consider a temporal scope with a future optimal energetic performance. The background data was from the EcoInvent consequential database, while the foreground inventories were built within the study based on previous inventories already published. As this is a consequential LCA, only marginal suppliers reacting to a change in the demand were considered. So here we consider the heat to be electrically supplied, while the electricity was considered to be the mix of France that is already implemented in the EcoInvent database. We use the environmental footprint method to account for the impacts using the Brightway model in the interface of Activity Browser. And as that, we consider that the biogenic emissions of CO2 will balance in the uptakes and release. So the system boundaries set were based to consider the end of the threshold scenarios from the previous section on the sub-modeling. And so we selected the pyrolysis and anaerobic digestion conversion pathways. Here we presented 3 scenarios. First, the business as usual, where 1 ton of the crop residues will just remain on the soil and will be plowed back in. The second scenario considers that the crop residues are supplied to the pyrolysis system, where biocrude is produced along with biochar, vinegar, and syngas. The biochar is applied to soil to be a carbon sequestration alternative, while the syngas is used to co-produce power and heat, and the vinegar replaces the use of fungicide. The biocrude is later upgraded by hydrodeoxygenation, where we produce syngas along with the hydrotreated pyrolysis oil, which is used to supply cargo ships and avoids the use of heavy fuel oil. And our third scenario considers that the crop residues are supplying the anaerobic digestion process, where digestate is co-produced and spread on soils, avoiding the use of mineral fertilizer, while the biogas is upgraded by cryogenic liquefaction, where we could recover the CO2 to avoid the production of liquid CO2. And we provide liquefied biomethane, here on bio-LNG, to the cargo ships, avoiding the use of the fossil liquefied natural gas. The impacts considered within the study were the climate change, respiratory inorganics, the freshwater eutrophication, marine water eutrophication, and the water use. This because they are considered key within the sea transport systems. So now we are going to present the contribution analysis results. First, we have the 3 scenarios together, and we led for the business as usual, the full environmental impact as an illustration of the impact avoided by the sustainable maritime fuel scenarios. Here, this line will represent a 0 impact, while the triangle and number represents the net impact of the pathway. So we can look at the climate change, and for instance, for the hydrotreated pyrolysis oil, HPO, we looked at the highest contribution to offset climate change came from the management of the biochar because it's allowed the carbon sequestration. While for the case of digestate, it was opposite, and it was the main contributor for the climate change emissions in the case of bio-LNG. Also, it is interesting in the case of bio-LNG that the upgrading process contributes to offset climate change. This is because the system of upgrading was said to be cryogenic liquefaction with the recovery of CO2. Now we will look at all the impacts together to try to see trends between them. First, we can see that there are some processes that will have a different impact or a different implication across the impacts. So as we already saw the climate change implication of the management of recalcitrant co-product, I will go through the others. In the case of bio-LNG, the digestate application is the main contributor to the marine eutrophication, freshwater eutrophication, respiratory inorganics. This is basically caused because of the condensed quantity of nitrogen within the digestate. Then we see that the combustion of the sustainable maritime fuel is also a high contributor of the emissions in the case of marine eutrophication for HPO and bio-LNG. This caused because in the emission factors supplied by the International Maritime Organization, the nitrogen is highly penalized in the emissions of sea transportation. And it's also high in the case of HPO for respiratory inorganics. The upgrading system of bio-LNG is the highest contributor to offset not only climate change, but also freshwater eutrophication and water scarcity. All of this caused by the recovery of the carbon dioxide. And another high contributor across different impacts is the use or the avoided agrochemicals. So for the case of marine eutrophication, freshwater eutrophication, and water scarcity, we noticed that the avoiding of mineral fertilizers will offset a great amount of these impacts. And in the case of HPO, for instance, in water scarcity, as we use the vinegar that will be recovered from the separation of the biocrude, it will avoid the use of water to mix the fungicides commonly used in the fields. So these results up till now had been only for 1 ton of crop residues. Now we want to see the trade-off if we scale it to the country national carbon neutral harvest potential. So first, remember that before we presented the carbon neutral harvest potential per technology as petajoules, but now it is presented as megatons of dry matter. As the case of pyrolysis was able to harvest all the harvestable crop residues, this has the same value as the business as usual, while the case of anaerobic digestion was approximately 50% of the one that we saw for pyrolysis. So for the case of climate change, we observed that for 1 ton of crop residues, the anaerobic digestion has approximately twofold the potential of pyrolysis to offset this impact. However, when we scale it to the carbon neutral harvest potential, the best performing technology changed and is now the pyrolysis. However, the difference between them is relatively low. In the case of eutrophication freshwater, however, the difference for 1 ton of crop residues is of 9-fold between anaerobic digestion and pyrolysis. And thus, even when we scale it to the whole national potential, that for anaerobic digestion is half of pyrolysis, anaerobic digestion continues to be the best performing technology. The case of eutrophication, marine water, and respiratory inorganics call attention for anaerobic digestion because they provide positive impacts. And in the case of respiratory inorganics, the impact is even higher than the business as usual one. This is caused mainly because of the nitrogen in the digestate, and it could be probably offset if we apply acidification technologies as those applied to manure to avoid the nitrogen mineralization. And the case of water scarcity also presented the highest environmental performance for anaerobic digestion in 1 ton of crop residues. It was almost 2 times that of pyrolysis, and when scaled to the whole national potential, it continued to be the best performing technology. Overall, the results for pyrolysis were always negative, and thus this is a technology with the potential to offset all the 5 impacts that we have assessed. While in the case of anaerobic digestion, it will be best performant for the case of eutrophication, freshwater, and water scarcity, but it will pose extra impact on the case of eutrophication, marine water, and respiratory inorganics. So now I will start the overall discussion of the study. So first, in the study, we produced many novelties to try to answer the research questions. So first, we created an extensive harmonized database to provide the average conversion and recalcitrance coefficients needed to integrate bioeconomical products within soil models. They are categorized based on process conditions, feedstock, and assessment methodology within this database. We also developed a novel framework to integrate the impact of multiple biomass conversion pathways on the self-maintenance, which allowed us to adapt 2 soil models, AMG and ROPC, to consider bioeconomy scenarios. And we applied the models in a high spatial resolution for France and Ecuador, which provided insights on the locations and co-products that could benefit the bioeconomy and stocks. Also, the baseline cropping systems of Ecuador, which did not exist before, was developed within the study, and this presents the crops residues potential of the country, the carbon flows in croplands, and the evapotranspiration data under the RCP 4.5 for Ecuador, which did not exist before. And to try to reveal the trade-off between the carbon neutral harvest and the overall impacts of the supply chain, we perform a consequential LCA comparing the hydrotreated pyrolysis oil and bioliquefied natural gas produced from crop residues. So we had some results that we wanted to know as the additional available biomass for the bioeconomy. And we found an extra 71 to 225 petajoules potential for France, depending on the technology, which is equivalent to the gross electricity in Greece or Austria, while this potential was of 113 petajoules for Ecuador. We noticed then that the pyrochar and gas char are key to improve the stocks in both countries, while the effect of the hydrochar and digestate is highly influenced by the specific pedoclimatic conditions, with results differing from one country to another. So for France, hydrochar and digestate have the potential to increase stocks in 88 and 50% of the areas studied, while in the case of Ecuador, hydrochar and digestate show not stock sequestration potential. When we performed the sensitivity analysis, we found that the carbon neutral harvest potential is more affected by the carbon conversion coefficient than the carbon recalcitrance, basically because of the higher range of the carbon conversion. The carbon neutral potential is maintained for the pyrolysis and gasification technologies for all the tested carbon conversion and carbon recalcitrance combinations, while in the case of the biochemical technologies as anaerobic digestion and bioethanol fermentation, due to the lower degree of recalcitrant, the carbon coefficient had a bigger impact. The priming effect had the highest impact in the stock evolution in the adapted ROTC model. And in the trade-off, we noticed that the HPO and bio-LNG accounted for 1 ton of crop straws could offset 90% of the emissions that we will account for the same amount of fossil maritime fuels. If we scale up the environmental impacts of 1 ton of crop straw to the national carbon neutral potential, a different best environmental performance pathway could be defined. However, this study was not short in limitations and challenges. There are many, but here I will present only the key or most important ones. First, the priming effect of the co-products studied remains still unacknowledged somehow, because they are contrasting results among studies. Upscaling laboratory experiments to represent real environmental interactions is still a challenge, and using them to represent in soil models is of high challenge in our study. The co-products coefficients are highly influenced by the conditions of the conversion pathway and the quantification methodology, and are thus a source of high variability. So when we set the scenario, we need to define what are the conditions of production of each technology. Returning the recalcitrant co-products to croplands may alter soil functions beyond only carbon. This study was set in the scope of only carbon. However, other nutrients and the microorganisms could be impacted by the return of these recalcitrant co-products. The interactions with this material may pose a change on the fertility, and this needs to be assessed further, for what we need more studies. And as an overall, this study entails 3 sources of uncertainty. One big source depends on the baseline data availability, which is different from one country to another. Another source is the co-products characteristics, which depend on the process conditions, assessment methodology, and also the feedstock. And the third one will be the way of how we integrate the co-products within the soil model and the soil model itself. And one big limitation in modeling and life cycle assessment studies is the lack of data, mostly for these future technologies like the cryogenic liquefaction that are not still well implemented around the globe. Besides this, we have future perspectives, as the field trials are now required to understand the effect of the co-products on the soil microbiota, to translate them into mathematical equations and include them in the soil models. This is currently being carried on by different study groups and projects across the world. One big focus is on the biochar, with various projects ongoing in Europe, at least, to better represent the biochar persistence within the soil models. A big perspective that we want to take into the study to make it further and create better conclusions is to implement simultaneously various pathways to evaluate the competitions and the synergies among them to derive the best management alternative. Also, another perspective of the study that was not considered here due to a lack of time is the inclusion of parallel carbon sequestration practices in the scenarios where we show SOC expected to decrease. So for instance, inclusion of cover crops or temporary grasslands in the crop rotations could help to offset the carbon losses observed in the digestate scenario. Another perspective is that in the case of consequential LCA, the International Maritime Organization has called now for a harmonized methodology for well-to-wake LCAs for sea transport, which are currently sparse, and more sparse in the case of consequential. So this is an opportunity to develop studies coupling the SOC modeling with the LCA methodologies to shed light to the trade-off between SOC sequestration and full environmental impacts of these biofuel supply chains for the sea transport system. And with the vision of the net zero goals, currently many regulations and incentives programs are being pushed towards the greenhouse gases emissions reduction and carbon sequestration. So studies providing models and databases as those that we develop here are available to explore the SOC sequestration alternatives. The study has already been valorized with one published paper, another one under review, and 3 that are being shaped to submit. We have presented the study in 7 different conferences, and the data here developed is openly available in the open repositories for 5 databases. I would like to end this presentation thanking or acknowledging my supervisors, my co-authors that helped within the development of this study, all the people that somehow helped me with the calculations, data manipulation, and data acquisition, my colleagues in TBI and in Ecuador, the FSPI project that supported this research, the jury members, the audience, and my family. Thank you.
Thank you, Christhel, for the presentation. Very clear and definitely the time skills. So we can move now to the part of the questions. We will wait a little. The other persons will leave the room. Just we have to be aware that there are some persons in the video, so maybe we have to speak very clearly and to be heard by our colleague. Is it okay for the person in video? You can hear us?
Moment.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, so
moment, please. I will activate them.